My name is Dr. Tony Fauci. I'm the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases at NIH. We knew the scenario that was going on in China. We prevented travel from China to the United States. If we had not done that, we would have had many, many more cases right here that we would have to be dealing with.
Dr. Fauci, what do you now understand about the morbidity? I mean, the Secretary refers to medically fragile people. Are you confident that if you're a relatively healthy young person, that this will not be fatal for you?
Okay. So the number in our country currently is low. But when you look at the pattern, it seems to be following the experiences that others have had. It's never 100%. If you look at the totality of the cases that have been reported, particularly from China, about 75 to 80% of them would do really quite well. They would just sort of like a bad flu or a cold. You get anywhere from 15 to 20 somewhat percent who are going to go on to require advanced medical care, hospitalization, possibly intensive care. For the most part, the people who get in trouble and ultimately, tragically, would die from this are people who are elderly and or have underlying conditions, heart disease, chronic lung disease, diabetes, obesity because of the difficulty in breathing back and forth. However, every once in a while, you're going to see a one-off. You're going to see a 25-year-old person who looks otherwise well that's going to get seriously ill. But the vast majority of the people who get into trouble do have these underlying conditions. And that's why it confuses people, because they say, well, you just said that, and then there's a report of a 40-year-old physician from China who died. That's going to happen. That happens with influenza. Most of the time, influenza kills people who are advanced age and underlying conditions. But you hear in the media every once in a while, a college student would get infected and ultimately die. But the majority is in that risk group.
And one more.
If you talk about the entire country, the whole 360 million people in this country, the risk is a low risk. I think the point you're making is that since we haven't done yet, but will happen really soon, the testing into the community, how do we know the risk is low? I would imagine it's still going to be low regardless of that. What happens in real time, which is the reason why we do this so frequently, is that things can change. But right now, today, on this day, Monday, if you look at the country as a whole, the risk is low.
All right, guys.
And we've said many times, if you talk about risk of infection throughout the country, it's a low risk. If you talk about someone who is infected, and we do have infected people in this country, you've heard that from Dr. Redfield. You understand the situation that we have in Seattle. If you do get infected, if you're infected as taking Seattle as the microcosm of that, it is exactly what Dr. Burke said. The risk of getting into difficulties is very heavily weighted towards people with underlying conditions and people with the elderly, where the young people, and there will be an exception here or there, the same way we see with influenza, but the risk for a young person who gets infected to getting into trouble is really low based on a lot of data that's coming out of foreign countries, particularly out of China. The ones who are clearly the most vulnerable to getting the complications of serious disease and even death are people with underlying conditions, particularly among the elderly with underlying conditions. And those are heart disease, lung disease, kidney disease, diabetes, et cetera. So what I'd like to do today is sort of like publicly answer a question that I get asked all the time now, is that if you are a person with an underlying condition, the conditions that I just mentioned, particularly if you're an elderly person with that, as the Vice President said, beyond even cruise ships, to just use the common sense of trying to protect yourself because you're the most vulnerable. That is often referred to as social distancing.
President. Dr. Fauci.
You're up to it.
More and more organizations, charities are canceling fundraising events, other events. Is that prudent? Is that an overreaction? Do you think the president should continue with campaign rallies? And do you believe that people, even if they're healthy, should get on board a cruise ship?
Okay, so there's multiple different questions, John. So the idea about individual entities, governors, mayors, or whatever, canceling activities that are not coming from a direct recommendation from the federal government. I think that they have I know they have the authority to do that, but what they're probably acting on is what they would consider for their citizens an abundance of caution. Most of the time when that happens, it usually is in an area where there is already documented community spread. And Dr. Redfield mentioned the 4 areas right now that are having community spread that's documented. But there may be, as we know, it's a possibility that there's community spread going on in areas in which we're not detecting it yet. And I think that's the response of the individuals, be they mayors or governors who have you, who are doing that. So I wouldn't criticize them for that. They're using their own individual judgment. And to me, I think that would be prudent.
Campaign rallies?
I can't comment on campaign rallies. It really depends. We are having, as we've all said, this is something in motion. This is an evolving thing. So not sure what we're going to be able to say at the time where you have a campaign rally. If you're talking about a campaign rally tomorrow in a place where there is no community spread, I think the judgment to have it might be a good judgment. If you want to talk about large gatherings in a place where you have community spread, I think that's a judgment call. And if someone decides they want to cancel it, I wouldn't publicly criticize them. I think if you're a healthy young person, that there is no reason, if you want to go on a cruise ship, to go on a cruise ship. Personally, I would never go on a cruise ship because I don't like cruises. But that's another story. But the fact is that if you have the conditions that I've been speaking about over and over again to this group, namely an individual who has an underlying condition, particularly an elderly person that has underlying condition, I would recommend strongly that they do not go on a cruise ship. So what we're saying today is that although we keep coming in and saying appropriately that as a nation, the risk is relatively low, there are parts of the country right now that are having community spread in which the risk there is clearly a bit more than that.
Can you say can you wait until there's community spread to make some of these decisions?
Well, it depends on the degree of community spread. I mean, community spread could be just a small amount, or you could start to see multiple generations. But getting to your individual question, that everything is on the table for consideration. So the idea that we're not closing I think for the country right now to say we're going to close all the schools in the country, I don't think would be appropriate. Would school closures be appropriate depending upon not whether you have already the horses out of the barn, but when you start to see we're getting a little bit dangerous here, so let's do it. So it's incorrect to say now everything has happened bad, let's close the school, and it's incorrect to say let's just blanket close the schools in the entire country tonight. I don't think that would be appropriate. Sounds very simplistic, but wash your hands as often as you possibly can. And I know you're not always in a position to be able to wash your hands, but wash them as much as you can. If you don't have the alcohol wipes, try and get them. If you can't get them, just try as best as possible to do it. I mean, you got to do the best you can. We will see more cases and we will see more suffering and death, predominantly, as the Vice President said, among the vulnerables in our society, the individuals with the conditions that we spoke to and the elderly. When I was young, a long time ago, I felt that I was invulnerable, the way I think many of us feel we're invulnerable. And when we're asking the young people to help us with this mitigation strategy by staying out of the bars, staying out of the restaurants, really trying to distance yourself, don't get the attitude, well, I'm young, I'm invulnerable. You are, well, in some respects, you're certainly less vulnerable than I am. However, what you might inadvertently do, and I know you don't want to do that, you don't want to put your loved ones at risk, particularly the ones who are elderly and the ones who have compromised conditions. We can't do this without the young people cooperating. Please cooperate with us. Thank you. We tend to think that we're not going to be able to mitigate or contain without testing. They complement each other in some respects, but they're separate channels. Even if we had no testing, we should be doing what we're doing now. The question you're asking, so I won't evade it specifically, would it be important outside of a doctor-patient coming in together, of knowing what's out there, what might be under the radar screen? The answer to your question is yes. So let me tell you what the CDC is doing right now. They're going out there, and part of their program is to get a feel for what is there that wasn't initially thought to be coronavirus, that was thought to be something else. When you do that, you're also going to get a feel of what the penetrance is in society. So we are heading with the high throughput things that you've been hearing about to get an answer to your question. I don't think with any moral conscience you could say, why don't we just let it rip and happen and let X percent of the people die? I don't understand that reasoning at all. Certainly there is some degree of asymptomatic transmissibility. It's still not quite clear exactly what that is. But when people focus on that, I think they take their eye off the real ball, which is the things you do will mitigate against getting infected, no matter whether you're near someone who is asymptomatic or not. It's the same thing. Physical separation and the care that's outlined here is going to take care of both of those things. For example, we are moving towards getting testing where you don't have to have PPE. I mean, I'm not going to tell you the day it's going to be there, but it's going to be a swab that you could stick in the nose of the person who is either infected or not, but that person doesn't need PPE, the person who's administering the test. So if you could do a self-administered test, stick it in a vial, hand it over. You don't need a mask, you don't need PPE. That's one of the things we're trying to do.
I would have liked that much better.
So Tedros is really an outstanding person. I've known him from the time that he was the Minister of Health of Ethiopia. I mean, obviously, over the years, anyone who says that the WHO has not had problems has not been watching the WHO. But I think under his leadership, they've done very well. He has been all over this. I was on the phone with him a few hours ago, leading a WHO call.
Praising China's transparency, sir?
No, I'm not talking about China. You asked me about Tedros.
World Health Organization praising China for its transparency and leadership on their response to the pandemic?
You know, I can't comment on that because, I mean, I don't have any viewpoint into it. I mean, I don't even know what your question is.